The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine pavement of Los Angeles International Airport's private terminal. Dr. Maya Richardson checked her watch. 6:45 a.m. She was right on schedule, just as she liked to be. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished floor as she pulled her burgundy Rimowa suitcase, its wheels spinning smoothly beneath her. At 42 years old, Dr. Richardson had earned every bit of her success. She had graduated at the top of her class from Johns Hopkins Medical School, completed her residency at Mayo Clinic, and now ran one of the most respected pediatric neurosurgery departments in the country. Today, she was headed to New York to deliver a keynote speech about her groundbreaking research in treating rare childhood brain conditions. The private terminal was quiet at this hour. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Maya could see several sleek private jets parked on the tarmac, their metal surfaces gleaming in the morning light. She had never been one to show off her wealth, but after 15 years of taking red-eye commercial flights between surgeries, she had finally decided to make her life a little easier. Time was precious when you saved children's lives for a living. She was dressed professionally but comfortably for the flight, a well-tailored navy pantsuit, crisp white blouse, and practical yet elegant low heels. Her natural hair was styled in neat, shoulder-length twists, and she wore minimal jewelry except for her mother's pearl earrings. They were her lucky charm for important presentations. As she approached the security checkpoint, Dr. Richardson pulled out her phone, where she had organized all her documentation in her usual methodical manner. Her pilot had already filed the flight plan, and her credentials were thoroughly in order. The conference organizers had arranged the private jet as part of her speaking engagement, a detail she had initially tried to decline until they insisted it was the only way to accommodate her tight schedule between surgeries. In her leather tote bag, she carried her laptop containing the presentation she had spent months perfecting. The research outlined in those slides could change the way doctors approached pediatric brain surgery, potentially saving hundreds of young lives. She also carried a thick medical file, the case of a particularly challenging patient she planned to review during the flight. The terminal was designed to cater to high-profile clients, with its modern architecture and premium amenities. Soft classical music played through hidden speakers, and the air was scented with a subtle vanilla fragrance. Dr. Richardson noticed a young couple in the waiting area, the woman cradling a sleeping infant. She smiled, remembering the countless babies she had operated on over the years. Each successful surgery meant another child who would have a chance at a full life. She pulled out her phone to check one last email from her assistant. There was a message about a potential emergency case that might need her attention when she returned tomorrow. This was exactly why she had finally agreed to private flights. The flexibility to return quickly if a patient needed her. Every minute could matter in her line of work. As she approached the security desk, Dr. Richardson noticed a guard watching her with unusual intensity. She was used to being scrutinized. Being one of the few black female neurosurgeons in the country meant she often had to deal with people's preconceptions. But she had learned long ago that the best response was to remain professional and let her credentials speak for themselves. She straightened her posture, though she was already standing tall, and prepared her documentation. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the silver thread in her suit, and she felt a surge of confidence. In her briefcase was research that could revolutionize her field. In her mind were skills that had saved hundreds of lives. In her heart was the same determination that had carried her from a small town in Georgia to the pinnacle of her profession. Little did Dr. Richardson know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. The security guard watching her was about to learn a profound lesson, one that would challenge his deepest biases and change both their lives in unexpected ways. As she took those final steps toward the security checkpoint, the stage was set for a confrontation that would turn into an opportunity for transformation. Security guard Thomas Webb had worked at the private terminal for 6 years. At 50 years old, with graying hair and tired eyes, he took pride in knowing all the regular clients who passed through his checkpoint. He straightened his blue uniform as Dr. Richardson approached, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," Webb called out, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. "This is a private aviation area. The main terminal is in the other direction." He stepped out from behind his desk, blocking Dr. Richardson's path to the security checkpoint. Dr. Richardson paused, maintaining her professional composure. She had encountered situations like this before, but it never stopped feeling like a small punch to the gut. "Good morning," she replied calmly, pulling up her documentation on her phone. I'm Dr. Maya Richardson. I have a private flight scheduled for 7:30 a.m. to New York. Webb crossed his arms across his chest. I'm going to need to see multiple forms of identification. His tone was different from the one he had used with the couple who had passed through just minutes earlier. And proof of your flight reservation. Other staff members nearby began to take notice of the interaction. A young female security officer named Sarah Martinez shifted uncomfortably at her post, watching the scene unfold. She had seen Webb do this before, but had never felt brave enough to speak up. Of course, Dr. Richardson responded, her voice steady. She pulled out her driver's license, medical license, and passport. Far more identification than was typically required. She also showed him the flight confirmation email and her conference keynote speaker invitation. I believe you'll find everything in order. Webb examined each document with exaggerated scrutiny, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. And who exactly arranged this flight for you? He pressed, his tone suggesting he didn't believe she could afford such luxury. The terminal had grown quieter now, with other travelers and staff watching the interaction. The classical music playing softly in the background seemed to emphasize the tension in the air. Dr. Richardson could feel their eyes on her, but she remained poised. The National Neurosurgery Conference arranged it, she explained patiently. I'm delivering the keynote address on pediatric brain surgery techniques this evening. You can call my pilot, Captain Stevens, to confirm. He filed the flight plan yesterday. Webb glanced at his computer screen, then back at her with doubtful eyes. Just wait here, he said firmly. I need to make some calls to verify all of this. He emphasized the word verify as if he was certain he would catch her in a lie. Dr. Richardson stood quietly, her hand resting on her suitcase handle. She noticed a framed photograph on Webb's desk that would soon change the entire dynamic of their interaction. It showed a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, lying in a hospital bed. She wore a bright yellow beanie that covered what appeared to be a recently shaved head. The minutes ticked by slowly. Other passengers walked past, some giving her sympathetic glances, others averting their eyes in discomfort. Dr. Richardson used the time to study Webb's body language, the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at the photo on his desk, the slight tremor in his hands as he made his calls. Finally, Webb's supervisor, a Mr. Johnson, hurried over. He had recognized Dr. Richardson's name immediately when Webb called. Dr. Richardson, he said, his face flushed with embarrassment. I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please, let me escort you through security myself. Webb's face reddened as his supervisor appeared, but Dr. Richardson noticed something else in his expression now, not just embarrassment, but a flicker of shame and perhaps fear as he glanced again at the photo on his desk. She made a decision in that moment that would shape everything that followed. Instead of filing a complaint or hurrying through to her flight, Dr. Richardson saw an opportunity. Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice wasn't with anger, but with understanding. She took a deep breath and prepared to turn this confrontation into a conversation that neither of them would ever forget. As Mr. Johnson started to escort Dr. Richardson through security, she gently raised her hand to stop him. The terminal had grown quiet, with everyone watching to see how she would handle the situation. But Dr. Richardson wasn't thinking about her audience. Her eyes were fixed on the photograph of the young girl on Webb's desk. Mr. Webb, she said softly, surprising him with the use of his name from his badge. Is that your daughter in the photo? She gestured toward the frame on his desk, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than accusation. Webb stiffened, clearly not expecting this response. His hand moved protectively toward the photograph, and for a moment, his stern facade cracked. Yes, he answered, his voice slightly hoarse. That's my Sarah. Dr. Richardson moved closer to the desk, her medical training taking over as she studied the image more carefully. The yellow beanie, the hospital setting, the particular shade of paleness in the girl's complexion. She had seen these signs hundreds of times before. She's being treated at Cedar Hills Children's Hospital, isn't she? I recognize the room design. Webb's eyes widened in surprise. How did you? He paused, looking at her differently now, confusion replacing his previous hostility. Yes, she's been there for 3 months. The supervisor, Mr. Johnson, started to interrupt, but Dr. Richardson raised her hand again, keeping her focus on Webb. She set her briefcase down and pulled out a medical journal with her photo on the back cover. I'm actually quite familiar with Cedar Hills. I helped design their pediatric neurosurgery ward. Other security staff members had gathered nearby, watching as the scene unfolded. Sarah Martinez, the young security officer who had witnessed the earlier confrontation, moved closer, intrigued by the change in atmosphere. "You're Sarah," Dr. Richardson continued, her voice gentle but professional. "She's about 12, isn't she? And from the setting in this photo, I'm guessing she's being treated in the neurology department." She didn't need to guess. She could tell from the room's layout in the photo, but she wanted Webb to share the information himself. Webb's posture changed subtly. His shoulders dropped, and the hardness in his eyes softened. "Yes, she." He swallowed hard. "She has a rare condition. The doctors say." He stopped, struggling to maintain his professional composure. Dr. Richardson noticed a coffee cup on his desk. It was from the hospital cafeteria, dated yesterday evening. "You were there last night, weren't you? That's why you look so tired today." Her observation was kind, not accusatory. The other staff members watched in amazement as their usually rigid colleague's defensive walls began to crumble. Webb nodded slowly, running a hand over his face. "Every night after my shift, the doctors are trying a new treatment plan, but you're worried." Dr. Richardson finished for him. She opened her briefcase and pulled out the presentation she was carrying. "Mr. Webb, do you know why I'm flying to New York today?" Without waiting for an answer, she turned her laptop screen toward him, showing slides filled with brain scans and medical diagrams. Webb's eyes fixed on the screen, particularly on one image that looked familiar. His voice trembled slightly. "This looks like Sarah's last scan." Dr. Richardson nodded. "I'm presenting new treatment methods for several rare neurological conditions, including the type that commonly affects children Sarah's age. In fact," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the conference where I'm speaking is being broadcast to several hospitals, including Cedar Hills." The tension in the terminal had transformed into something entirely different. The other staff members who had been watching with disapproval now stood in respectful silence. Mr. Johnson, who had been ready to discipline Webb, now watched with growing understanding. Webb's hands were shaking slightly as he looked again at Dr. Richardson's credentials, this time seeing not just a passenger to be questioned, but possibly someone who could help his daughter. The shame of his earlier behavior was evident on his face, but mixed with it was a desperate hope that parents of sick children know all too well. Dr. Richardson could have walked away. She could have filed a complaint. Instead, she saw a father's fear for his child and recognized an opportunity to turn this moment of prejudice into something healing, not just for Webb's daughter, but for the deeper wounds of bias that had caused this confrontation in the first place. Webb sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Dr. Richardson pulled up a nearby seat, her flight momentarily forgotten. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting a warm glow over them both as the truth of their connection began to unfold. "Sarah was diagnosed 3 months ago," Webb said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out his phone and showed Dr. Richardson a more recent photo. The young girl was smiling despite her condition, her bright eyes shining with the resilience of youth. "The doctors said it's a rare form of brain tumor. They're trying different treatments, but..." He trailed off, his hands trembling slightly. Dr. Richardson leaned forward, studying the image with professional interest. "Has she been experiencing headaches? Changes in her vision?" she asked, her medical training taking over. Webb looked surprised. "Yes, exactly. The headaches started about 4 months ago. Then she began having trouble seeing the whiteboard at school." He paused, wondering how this woman he had just treated so poorly could know these specific details. "Mr. Webb," Dr. Richardson said gently, "I treated over 200 cases similar to Sarah's." She opened her laptop again, this time turning to a specific page in her presentation. "Look at this scan. This was one of my patients from last year, a 13-year-old girl with the same symptoms." Webb's eyes widened as he looked at the images. The brain scans looked remarkably similar to Sarah's. What happened to her?" he asked, fear and hope mixing in his voice. "She's starting high school this fall," Dr. Richardson smiled. "She's on the swim team now." She scrolled through her presentation to show a follow-up scan. "This is her brain 6 months after we tried a new surgical approach I developed." The other security staff had quietly gathered around, drawn by the intensity of the conversation. Sarah Martinez, the young officer, was wiping tears from her eyes. Even Mr. Johnson stood silently, his earlier anger completely forgotten. The procedure I'm presenting in New York today, Dr. Richardson continued, her voice steady and reassuring, is an improved version of that technique. We've had an 85% success rate in our initial trials. She pulled out a business card from her wallet. The conference is being streamed live to Cedar Hills. Dr. Thompson, Sarah's doctor, will be watching. Webb stared at the business card in his hands, then back at Dr. Richardson. The realization of how he had treated someone who could potentially help his daughter hit him full force. Dr. Richardson, he started, his voice cracking with emotion and shame. The universe works in strange ways, Mr. Webb, Dr. Richardson said kindly. Sometimes it brings the right people together, even in uncomfortable situations. She glanced at her watch. She still had time before her flight. Tell me more about Sarah. How is she handling the treatments? For the next few minutes, Webb shared his daughter's story. He told Dr. Richardson about Sarah's love for painting, how she still tried to create art even on her bad days. He described her bravery during treatments, and how she kept her yellow beanie collection growing, one for each week of her hospital stay. As Webb talked, the other staff members listened intently. They had never seen this side of their stern colleague, the worried father behind the tough security guard exterior. His earlier prejudiced behavior stood in stark contrast to his current vulnerability. Dr. Richardson listened carefully, her trained mind already connecting symptoms and possibilities. She noticed details in Webb's description that could be crucial for treatment, information that only a parent's careful observation could provide. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the terminal floor. In the distance, the sound of a jet taking off reminded everyone that this was still an airport, that normal life was continuing around them. But here, in this small corner of the private terminal, something extraordinary was happening. A moment of prejudice was transforming into a chance for hope. As Webb finished speaking about his daughter, Dr. Richardson reached for her briefcase. What she was about to share would change not only Sarah's future, but also Webb's entire perspective on making assumptions about others. Dr. Richardson opened her medical bag and pulled out several research papers. Her fingers moved quickly through the pages until she found what she was looking for. The terminal had grown quiet again, but this time with anticipation rather than tension. Look at this, Mr. Webb, she said, spreading the papers on his desk. These are the results from our latest clinical trials. She pointed to a series of before and after brain scans. The tumor type you described, its location, the symptoms, Sarah's age, it matches our research profile exactly. Webb leaned forward, his security uniform crinkling as he moved. Though the medical terminology was foreign to him, he could clearly see the difference between the before and after images. The tumor. It's almost gone in these pictures, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Yes, Dr. Richardson nodded, her eyes lighting up with professional passion. We developed a new surgical technique that allows us to reach these tumors without damaging the surrounding tissue. She pulled out a pen and began drawing a simple diagram on a blank paper. Traditional methods approach from this angle, but we found a different path. Sarah Martinez, the young security officer, had moved closer. Is that why you're going to New York, Dr. Richardson? She asked, genuinely interested. To share this new technique. Exactly, Dr. Richardson smiled. And the timing couldn't be better. She turned back to Webb. The conference is being broadcast to major hospitals across the country. Dr. Thompson at Cedar Hills will be watching, and now he'll know to look out for Sarah's case specifically. Webb's hands trembled as he touched the images. All this time, he said quietly, I've been praying for a miracle for Sarah. And today, he couldn't finish the sentence, emotion choking his words. Dr. Richardson placed a gentle hand on the papers. Mr. Webb, I believe things happen for a reason. Even difficult moments can lead to unexpected blessings. She didn't need to spell out the irony of their initial confrontation. It hung in the air between them, already transforming into something meaningful. The other staff members watched as their colleague's tough exterior continued to crack. The man who had been so quick to judge based on appearance was now hanging on every word from the very person he had tried to turn away. Tell me more about Sarah's art, Dr. Richardson said, pulling out her phone to take notes. The connection between artistic ability and brain function is fascinating, and it could be relevant to her treatment plan. She opened her calendar app. I'll be back in Los Angeles tomorrow evening. If you'd like, I could review her complete medical file. Webb nodded eagerly, then paused as shame crossed his face again. Dr. Richardson, I don't deserve your kindness, the way I treated you. He looked down at his desk, unable to meet her eyes. Mr. Webb, she interrupted gently, in my line of work, I've learned that growth often comes from uncomfortable moments. What matters is what we learn from them. She smiled warmly. And right now, what matters most is helping Sarah. The morning sunlight had shifted, creating a warm glow around them. In the background, the sounds of the airport continued. Announcements over the speakers, the distant roar of engines, the quiet conversations of other travelers. But in this moment, at this security desk, something profound was taking place. Mr. Johnson, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. Dr. Richardson, please let me personally escort you to your flight when you're ready. He glanced at his watch. We can hold the departure for a few minutes if needed. Dr. Richardson nodded gratefully, then turned back to Webb. She pulled out more papers from her bag, these containing detailed information about the treatment protocol. While I'm gone, I want you to read through these. They'll help you understand what we might be able to do for Sarah. As she explained the medical details in simple terms, Webb listened with complete attention. The man who had stood so arrogantly in her way just 30 minutes ago was now learning about hope from the very person he had prejudged. The transformation was visible not just in his face, but in his entire demeanor. The terminal's atmosphere had completely changed from the tense confrontation of earlier. A young flight attendant approached the security desk, holding a tablet with the passenger manifest displayed on the screen. She glanced between the tablet and Dr. Richardson, then spoke directly to Webb. Mr. Webb, Dr. Richardson's credentials have all been triple verified, she said, turning the screen toward him. She's listed as a VIP passenger. The medical conference organizers specifically requested her private flight arrangement due to her schedule of emergency surgeries. Her voice carried a gentle but clear rebuke. Webb's face flushed deep red as he stared at the screen. There it was in black and white. Dr. Maya Richardson, head of pediatric neurosurgery, keynote speaker. The same person who might now be his daughter's best hope for recovery was the one he had profiled and tried to turn away. Sarah Martinez, still standing nearby, stepped forward with a folder. I also found Dr. Richardson's press coverage, sir, she said, her voice steady. She was featured in Medical Journal Monthly last year for saving 16 children with extremely rare brain conditions. She placed the folder on Webb's desk, open to a page showing Dr. Richardson in surgery, focused and confident. The reality of his prejudiced behavior hit Webb like a physical blow. He looked around at his colleagues' faces, some showing disappointment, others sympathy, all of them watching this moment of truth unfold. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making his security uniform feel too tight around his neck. I've been working here for 6 years, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. 6 years of judging people based on. He couldn't finish the sentence, the shame too heavy in his throat. Dr. Richardson, who had been reviewing Sarah's treatment notes, looked up. She saw a man being forced to confront his own biases in the most personal way possible, through the realization that those same biases might have prevented him from finding help for his child. Mr. Webb, she said gently, sometimes life's most important lessons come in unexpected packages. She gestured to the medical papers spread across his desk. What matters now is what you do with this understanding. Other passengers in the terminal had been watching the scene unfold. An elderly gentleman in an expensive suit approached the desk. Dr. Richardson, he said, I've read your research on pediatric brain tumors. My grandson was treated using your methods at Boston Children's last year. You're the reason he's back in school now. Webb's hands began to shake as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The person he had tried to block, whose presence he had questioned, whose credentials he had doubted, was not only legitimate but renowned in her field. And more than that, she was exactly the person his daughter needed. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat. Dr. Richardson, your pilot has completed all pre-flight checks. We shouldn't delay your departure any longer. He turned to Webb. Thomas, I think we need to have a serious discussion about. Actually, Dr. Richardson interrupted smoothly. Mr. Webb and I have already started a more important discussion about his daughter's treatment options. She gave Mr. Johnson a meaningful look. Sometimes the best response to a mistake is to learn from it and focus on moving forward. Webb looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The security guard's tough exterior had completely crumbled, replaced by the vulnerable worry of a father whose child was suffering. Dr. Richardson, I don't know how to even begin to apologize. The morning sun had risen higher now, its warm light filling the terminal. Through the large windows, they could see Dr. Richardson's private jet waiting on the tarmac. In just a few hours, she would be presenting research that could change lives, including, perhaps, the life of a young girl whose father had nearly turned her away because of his prejudices. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. What had begun as an ugly display of bias had transformed into a powerful lesson about judgment, humanity, and the mysterious ways in which help sometimes arrives, even when we initially tried to turn it away. Instead of hurrying to her flight, Dr. Richardson took a moment to pull up a chair next to Webb's desk. The terminal had grown quiet again, but this time with a sense of anticipation. This was no longer about a confrontation. It was about transformation. "Mr. Webb," she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used when explaining complex procedures to worried parents, "I'd like to share something with you." She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of herself as a young medical student. 10 years ago, I was often stopped in hospital hallways because people didn't believe I was a doctor, she explained, swiping to show more photos of her journey. Security guards would question my presence in the doctor's lounge. Patients would ask to see the real doctor when I walked in. Webb listened intently, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine attention. His hands were folded in his lap, his security badge catching the morning light. A reminder of the authority he had misused just moments ago. "But here's what I learned," Dr. Richardson continued, showing him a photo of herself with a young patient. "Every difficult moment became a chance to educate someone. Every person who doubted me and then saw their mistake became an ally in fighting prejudice." Sarah Martinez, the young security officer, moved closer. "How did you stay so calm?" she asked, thinking about how differently the situation could have gone if Dr. Richardson had reacted with anger. Dr. Richardson smiled. "Because I've learned that anger, though justified, rarely changes hearts. But connecting on a human level, that's what creates real change." She turned back to Webb. "When I saw the photo of Sarah, I knew this was another opportunity. Not just to help a child, but to show why we must never judge people based on their appearance." Webb nodded slowly, his eyes moving between the photo of his daughter and Dr. Richardson. "I've worked here for years," he said quietly. "I turned away people, questioned them, made them feel unwelcome, all because I thought I could tell who belonged here just by looking at them." Other security staff members shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing similar behaviors in themselves. Mr. Johnson stood nearby, listening intently to every word. "The hardest part of growth," Dr. Richardson said, "is acknowledging our mistakes. But you're doing that right now, Mr. Webb. And more importantly, you're showing that you're ready to learn from this experience." She pulled out her medical journal again, turning to a specific page. "Look at these physicians," she said, pointing to a group photo of diverse doctors. "Every one of them has a story similar to mine. But each time someone like you learns from an experience like this, we move a little closer to a world where these stories won't need to be told." Webb's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the photos. "All this time," he whispered, "I've been praying for help for Sarah. And when it arrived, I almost turned it away because of my own prejudice." The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the floor. In the distance, they could hear the sound of jets taking off, a reminder that life was continuing around them. Dr. Richardson checked her watch. Her flight would need to leave soon, but she knew these few minutes might be the most important part of her day, even more than the conference presentation. "Mr. Webb," she said, standing up, "I want you to do something for me." She handed him a small notebook. "Start keeping track of every time you make an assumption about someone. Write it down, then write down what you learned when that assumption was proved wrong." Webb took the notebook with trembling hands. "I will," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "And Dr. Richardson, thank you. Not just for Sarah, but for teaching me instead of condemning me." The other staff members watched as their colleague, known for his rigid judgments and quick suspicions, began his journey toward change. They could see in his face that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how he viewed Dr. Richardson, but in how he would view everyone who came through his security checkpoint from now on. Before boarding her flight, Dr. Richardson took one final moment at the security desk. She pulled out several business cards and wrote her personal cell phone number on the back of one. The terminal had taken on an almost sacred atmosphere, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Mr. Webb," she said, handing him the card with her number, "I want you to call this number tomorrow at 3 p.m. I'll be finished with my presentation by then, and we can discuss Sarah's case in detail." She placed the other cards on his desk. "These are for your colleagues. Sometimes they might encounter passengers who need medical assistance or consultation." Webb held the card as if it were made of gold. "Dr. Richardson, I don't know how to thank you," he began, but she gently raised her hand to stop him. "Thank me by changing," she said simply. "Thank me by treating every person who comes through your checkpoint with the respect they deserve. Thank me by remembering that appearances never tell the whole story." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Dr. Richardson, I want you to know that we'll be implementing new training procedures immediately." He looked meaningfully at Webb. "This incident has shown us that we need to do better." Sarah Martinez, who had witnessed everything from the beginning, spoke up. "I've already started making notes for a new security protocol," she said, showing a notebook filled with fresh writing. "We can use this experience to help train other officers." Dr. Richardson smiled approvingly. "That's exactly right. Every difficult moment can become a teaching tool." She turned to Webb again. "Which reminds me, don't forget about the notebook I gave you. Writing down our assumptions is the first step to challenging them." Through the terminal windows, they could see the private jet's crew making final preparations. The morning sun had risen fully now, promising a clear flight to New York. But before leaving, Dr. Richardson had one more thing to share. She pulled out her phone one last time and showed Webb a photo he hadn't seen before, a recent picture of the teenage patient she had mentioned earlier, one who had recovered from a similar condition to Sarah's. The girl was swimming, her face bright with joy and health. "This could be Sarah next year," Dr. Richardson said softly. "But getting there will require more than just medical treatment. It will take a community of support." She looked around at the security staff. "And sometimes that community forms in the most unexpected places." Webb nodded, understanding her deeper meaning. He stood straighter, his security uniform now feeling less like a symbol of authority and more like a reminder of responsibility. "I promise you, Dr. Richardson, things will be different here from now on." The other staff members murmured in agreement. Even some of the passengers who had witnessed the entire scene were nodding, touched by the transformation they had observed. Mr. Johnson finally gestured toward the departure gate. "Dr. Richardson, your pilot says we really must get you on board now." He smiled warmly. "Though I have to say, your presence here this morning may have helped more people than your conference will." As Dr. Richardson gathered her belongings, Webb quickly wrote something in the notebook she had given him. When she glanced over, she saw he had written, "Today I learned that help and wisdom can come from anyone, and my prejudices nearly cost my daughter her chance at healing." Tomorrow at 3 p.m., Dr. Richardson reminded him, picking up her briefcase. "And Webb, bring those recent scans of Sarah's that you mentioned. I have some ideas I'd like to discuss." As she walked toward her flight, escorted by Mr. Johnson, the security staff and nearby passengers broke into spontaneous applause. It wasn't just for her medical achievements or her kindness to Webb. They were applauding the remarkable way she had turned a moment of bias into an opportunity for growth and healing. Webb stood at his security desk, watching her leave, the business card secure in his pocket and the notebook open before him. In just 1 hour, his entire worldview had been transformed. As he turned to greet the next passenger approaching his checkpoint, his smile was genuine, his eyes were clear, and his heart was open to seeing people for who they truly were, not who he assumed them to be.